opening opposition. So, justifications. Opening government. I think you have sort of three big claims. The first is a sort of general principle about local democratic accountability. We hear a variety of material that lockdowns are very coercive, that local elections are more relevant to individuals, that there's a greater degree of accountability. Um, I think in terms of the top half, in terms of the rest of the debate, a lot of your principled arguments don't really hold a great deal of water, as is pointed out both in a POI from closing opposition and rebuttal from opening opposition. While it's true, for instance, that no one voted for central governments based on their ability to manage COVID, that the same is symmetrical for local governments. I think your stuff about local elections being easier to arrange, I found somewhat implausible. The UK, for instance, has suspended a load of regional elections. I don't think it would be able to suspend national elections. The strong material that I think you do bring to the debate is more about the principle of making people feel that governments are legitimate and how local states are likely to act more effectively. So, in terms of the sort of practical harms you give, firstly, I think that there's a decent amount of material explaining why in states where the central government is perceived as unfair or alien from local administrations, if they are the ones to impose lockdowns, they are likely to behave in selfish ways that will mean that those lockdowns are not followed, and therefore you will see death, etc. Secondly, that the federal government is likely to overly homogenize a response that hits particular regions. How does this weigh up against what we get from opening opposition? I think opening opposition bring a couple of things. The first thing they say is a sort of practical claim around how you need a centralized response and you need speed in terms of being able to impose lockdowns and also to be able to do things like coordinate test and trace programs. I do think this is reasonably effectively rebutted by opening government, who point out that you can still do coordination over issues like test and trace, and even if a lockdown is imposed somewhat quicker if it's done centrally, I think that the harm of this being perceived as illegitimate and divisive may well mean that it is completely ineffective. Secondly, we get a degree of material about how if there are a variety of local responses, states may behave in unselfish ways, and so you need to coordinate local interests, and B, there might be a degree of confusion about different types of regional regulations. I think the issue that I had with the question of confusion is that opening government are clear that you can have regional lockdowns. So I think that is sort of somewhat symmetrical on both sides. But on the question of states being selfish, while I agree that in an abstract it may be necessary for states to coordinate local interests, I think perhaps you lacked specificity about precisely what conflicting local interests actually looked like in the real world. I think this was a problem compared to opening government, who at least had a degree of clear analysis about precisely how federal lockdowns would prove worse. So ultimately, I think top half is somewhat close. I think you are reasonably effective at knocking down the principal argumentation that opening government bring to the debate, although I don't think that benefits your case particularly. And then I'm left with a sort of question over whether it's better to have a quick centralized response or a more legitimate and somewhat more locally focused response. I think ultimately opening government just do a slightly better job at explaining why A, local legitimacy, and B, a sort of less blunt approach from the central government is likely to be better. I think this is this tension, this clash is also one which helps opening government because of a failure from the deputy leader to take POIs from OG. I do think that's a problem in terms of it meant that some of the new material that got brought into the opposition case didn't wasn't given a chance to be rebutted. So quite narrowly, I felt that opening government won top half. In terms then about why the second went to closing government, I think what closing government bring to the debate is slightly more specificity about how local states can effectively allocate resources, for instance, over issues of categorizing essential workers. I think they also flip some of the O material about a need for a speedy lockdown by suggesting that states, precisely because they are selfish and want to prevent outbreaks, can themselves impose lockdowns more effectively and more quickly. And I think finally, there's some really good material from closing government about how state governments have just a better degree of local knowledge. That means they, when they impose lockdown measures, they're likely to be particularly effective in terms of subclusters. So in terms of comparing the two teams, I think ultimately closing government are simply more effective on issues of the efficacy of lockdown when they talk about the local knowledge of states, when they talk about the ability of states to for instance, coordinate lockdowns in certain sectors in a way that doesn't hurt the economy as much. And I think what helps them additionally relative to their opening team is I think the CG case is perhaps less reliant on malign or unpopular federal states. I think elements of the Gov case are more reliant on the sort of absolute worst case scenario federal government, whether that's the Spanish government imposing lockdown on Catalonia, or Bolsonaro not giving not caring about Sao Paulo. I think closing government probably have more universal arguments that is less about federal authorities being actively bad, but rather local authorities having a greater degree of accountability. How then do closing opposition fit into this debate? I think, firstly, they, I think, definitively win the issue of principle and democratic accountability. How do they do this? Firstly, I think that they do a convincing job about saying that what is most important is having clear demarcations of authority, so that you can have practically better policies, which I'll get onto later, but B, I just think from a democratic perspective, so that you know that if a COVID response hasn't gone well, you know precisely who you can blame for that. I do think that knocks down a lot of the OG material. The response that closing government give on this question of accountability is to say, well, even if the federal government is administering all the COVID response, you can still do things like blame migrants or blame China, whatever. I think that's a partial response, but I am convinced at the end of the debate that it is much harder if the federal government is in sole control over not just lockdown, but also contact tracing, PPE policy. It is just a lot harder for them to shirk responsibility. I think comparatively, if you have state governments with responsibility for one element of COVID policy and the central government with responsibility for other areas of COVID policy, you will get worse scrutiny and you will get worse accountability. The second area that I think CO do very well on this is talking about the negative incentives that states are going to have in sort of more concrete terms. I think they do this in a couple of ways. Firstly, there's the sort of slightly wishy-washy, a nation is only as strong as its weakest link stuff. I think where this becomes stronger is linking back to their accountability point. It is easier if you know that central government, rather than a variety of actors, are making errors, it is easier to subsequently correct badly implemented lockdowns. But two, there's always going to be an incentive when you're trading off lives versus economic damage for individual states to try to compete against each other, for instance, by not locking down in order to sort of screw the other state and take jobs away from them. I think that's a sort of really important issue that the central government, and really only the central government, can fix in terms of being able to set national regulations. Finally, I think that there's some like good degree of responses to a lot of the positive material that comes out of closing government, particularly on this issue of local knowledge. So the sort of CG and to an extent OG claim is, this very idealized notion of local government, that the people, that politics is personal. And I think closing opposition do point out reasonably fairly that local governments are often, equally huge. And therefore, while I'm willing to concede that the, government of California has slightly better local knowledge than the federal government, I certainly don't think it's quite as detailed and granular as closing government want to portray it. So I think closing opposition do a really good job, both at knocking down a lot of the practical benefits that government teams want to put up. I think they win the issue of principles and democratic accountability. And I think that they sort of talk in the most detailed and nuanced ways about how local authorities are likely to behave in ways which both hurt the economy and hurt health outcomes. So I hope that's somewhat clear. Feel free to contact me on Facebook or Discord if you want any future feedback, and best of luck in upcoming rounds. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. If we want feedback, would it be possible to get it now in the Zoom call?